So over to Australia though, for our next speaker, in a much warmer place, to Brian Cook, who's going to be our next speaker. So Brian is an associate professor in human geography, in the University of Melbourne, and his research explores how society interacts with science, but in the context of managing risks. Um, and he leads the Community Engagement for Disaster Risk Reduction, CDRR, project, which has been going for a good 4 years and has got one more year to go. And it's engaging 4,500 flood-prone households in Victoria, Australia. And the region suffers from all types of different flooding, from floodplain to coastal to rivers. So it's got a lot of challenges in a sort of climate emergency. He also leads an 8-year research program working with smallholder farmers in Cambodia, looking at how they can manage different farming risks in the sort of the climate emergency we face. Brian's teams undertake large-scale mixed methods research to integrate quantitative analysis with qualitative depth. And he completed his PhD back in the UK in Durham. So his talk is entitled Awareness Does Not Equal Action, Longitudinal Evidence on Household Adaptation to Flood Risk.
How does that look? All right, people can see it and they can't see my silly jokes already written on the side. Thank you so much. And it's nice to follow that, Lori. I did do my PhD in Durham a long time ago, and the house was bloody cold, let me tell you. And so watching that was brought back some scrunch, if I have to be honest. So that was well, it wasn't pleasant, but I appreciated the talk. Um, Thanks, everyone. I'm going to give this presentation. I've timed myself a few times. It's right at 20 minutes, and hopefully I can keep that. I'm a human geographer. I'm really interested in behavior and risk and how we go about knowing and how we study it. And so the talk I'm going to give today is going to show you some findings from a very, very large mixed methods study. So it's statistical, it's quant, numbery type stuff, but it's also narratives and accounts and people's voices. And I hope you see the value of looking at it through both lenses. Um, I'm going to jump right in. Oh, I'm going to try. There we go. First couple minutes, I'm going to give you some background on the work. I'm going to talk about the method, although the method could be days of talking. And so I'll give you just a short take on that. If you can only remember three elements of this talk, here they are. Cross-sectional design, so like surveys, these sort of engagements with people, generate a structural false positive that make awareness and concern look like behavioral drivers. And so I'll tell you and I'll evidence that as we go, but that's the first stage. The second is that when we add longitudinal engagements over time, a lot of what we think are drivers of behavior fall apart. They don't stand the rigorous sort of quantitative analysis. And I think that that's a sort of cautionary tale. It might confirm something you think you already know if you've been in the behavior change literature for long. And then what I'm going to do is show you an alternative, which is a sort of learning typology that we apply to these many thousands of engagements to explain who adapts and why. And at the end, I guess my conclusion will say something to the effect of like, what does that mean for those of us who are interested in behavior change efforts? And that's, if you want to zone out now, you can, and you can come back at the conclusion. But that's really where we're headed today. Those are the confines of the talk. Household scale adaptation is widely assumed to be the foundation of resilience, right? Like and I think Liz's intro basically said that. But we actually have very little evidence, empirical evidence, about whether the mechanisms and the tools that we use to promote it actually work. We have global stock takes that repeatedly warn that adaptation is failing to keep pace with rising climate risks, and that current strategies rest on some untested assumptions. We make a lot of assumptions about what works, and awareness and concern are two of the most prominent. Basically, the assumption, whether it's called the deficit model, the banking model, whatever model you want to call it, but this enlightenment sort of idea that says as people become more aware or more concerned about something, they will adapt. That assumption ultimately guides so much of what we do, and I think it's not as founded in empiricism as proponents might like to think. So dominant models in disaster psychology and risk communication and communications more generally assume that higher awareness or concern leads to adaptation. Reviews show that almost all supporting evidence comes from these single time point analyses and the use of a lot of inference and proxies that I'll get into in a bit, and that longitudinal studies that track the same households at large scale using mixed methods are extremely rare. And that's kind of my pitch for my project, I guess, if I was putting a grant together. Here's the methods. Hold on. The intervention that I run is grounded in participatory, dignity-based research. And I want to give a shout out to Hicks's work on post-genocidal reconciliation. Awful stuff, but it really gets at what it means to go into a community where there's conflict and lingering antagonism and violence and have to engage. And so we're informed by that. And these engagements follow a dialogic, person-centered structure that combines active processing and critical self-reflection. Rather than deliver information, the facilitators who undertake the research focus entirely on listening to participants tell us about their experiences, their perceptions, their constraints, their aspirations. Information is provided when it's asked for. And oftentimes we don't know the answer that they ask, and we'll go out and find it and we bring it back to them. But it is only in response to what people want. The methodology rejects communication-based awareness-raising models. So each engagement integrates quantitative and qualitative data collection. What happens is a kind of quantitative survey interspersed with qualitative questions. And that gives us a mixed sort of Likert numerical and narrative-based data set that allows us depth. And we have that twice, so we have that over time. Participants are asked to reflect on their risk appetite, on their awareness, on their past experience, on current assessments, on their future behavior. We collect demographics alongside that. For about 4 to 6 months later, a follow-up takes place using the same philosophy and the same methods. Those engagements look at what they can recall, if anything, what they remember, what they learned, what stood out to them, whether or not they could describe changes that had happened in the meantime, whether they took action, whether they actually adapted, whether they spoke to others and spilled over. And then we elicit feedback on risk governance more generally and on the engagement and the methodology itself. The intervention is intentionally non-coercive, non-directive. We don't prescribe any actions. We don't steer participants towards any predefined behavioral outcome. The purpose is to create the conditions for discussion, listening, and reflection. And we judge that based on whether or not participants enjoyed and appreciated the engagement at follow-up. I don't really care if they've adapted. What I care is if they valued the interaction and found it useful. Turns out they do adapt, but I don't think we should judge the success, or I think we should judge the success based on whether or not people enjoyed it. There's no control in this, even though it's large scale and quantitative. And that's because withholding an engagement from people or doing it badly in order to create a control condition is just unethical. I don't really want to do that, but it would never get through ethics here at Melbourne. So the ethical framework prioritizes participant dignity, autonomy, and safety over experimental control. And the engagements are all voluntary, conversational, and paced according to the household's comfort. There you go. We engage with people. We mostly listen. We ask them questions about themselves, and we follow up with them. We supply anything that they've asked for. And it turns out that if you co-produce that environment and you do a lot of listening and really care, the impacts are immense. And let me show you. I'm sure that method, you know, anyway. One of the case studies is Kingston, which is south of Melbourne. It's a relatively large suburb. I mean, it's a giant city, right? So it's all city. Looks a little bit like that. These are the flood-prone homes in Kingston. They are the 1% AEP. You might hear 1 in 100-year flood. It's better to think of it as they have a 1% chance of flooding every year, which is pretty substantive. right? And so these are flood-prone homes. These are the ones we door knocked. So you can see we got very good coverage. There's about 5,000 of them here in this part of Kingston. And these are the participants with a little bit of error inserted so that you can't track them down. In total, we undertook 1,802 initial engagements and follow-ups for the project to date. We're still doing them by the day. There's a parallel fire case study for comparison with the flood work that has undertaken 734. The analysis today is going to be based on two case studies, Darebin and Kingston, who are very similar, comparable, and they are based on 982 initial engagements and 638 follow-up engagements. Again, all those engagements follow the kind of quant and qual. We audio record it, we transcribe it, we code it, and we analyze it, and we turn the qualitative data into quantitative data for statistical analysis, running regressions to see what trends there are within the data. So what kind of things do we look for? Well, if you imagine time point one and time point two, which is what these T1 and T2s are, you might imagine, or you might even be curious yourself, whether people who have experienced the flood in the past act. Are they more likely to act than your average person? What about someone who believes they're at risk? What about someone who's wealthy? What about someone in the flood zone or out the flood zone? What about if you've lived there a long time? What about if you promise to do it? What about if you believe you're influential on others? All these sorts of behavioral kind of assumptions that we have in the flood risk and risk literature around who acts and why are often not really known empirically. And so we analyze all of these hypotheses. And in a conceptual model, it kind of looks like this. If you imagine T1 as the predictors, those are all the like, what's your risk appetite? What's your past? What's your values? What's your demographics? We kind of get all of that in there. And then in the impact zone, we have five kind of key mediators. And those are the three types of learning. And I'm going to define those for you in a second. Actual adaptation, which is the actions. And I want to really flag here. It's not, I promise I will. It's not, I'm thinking about it. It's not, I intend to. It's, I did. Okay, the only thing we're interested in the action space is actual adaptations that have happened in the 6 months since the initial engagement that are attributed to that interaction. Okay, so it's very, very resolutely focused on actual behavior, not proxies and whatnot for it, and not promissory type measures. The sharing is kind of a spillover effect or a cascade, whatever term you want to use. It's people sharing either behaviors or learning or knowledge with someone who is a non-participant in the project. And we try to trace that out and we do the social analysis of that. So the key things that I want you to kind of know in the definition, I'm trying to look at my time here, I think I'm halfway, is this cognitive learning, normative learning, and relational learning. You're going to need these to make sense of the conclusion. Cognitive learning is basically awareness. And this is from Baird's work, who works with Huitma, and all of them basically trace themselves to the transformative learning Mesereau kind of grandfather, I guess. But cognitive learning would be the acquisition of a fact, right? Someone in this analysis who goes, you live in a flood zone. Oh, I live in a flood zone. There you go. That's a fact. That in our coding would be coded as a cognitive learning instance. It would become a one in that column of the Excel sheet. So that's pretty straightforward. The normative learning is a change in values or perceived social obligations or feelings. It's often when we're coding for it, it's someone who might go, oh, I live in a flood zone. Oh, that makes me feel anxious, nervous, angry, something. There's a pivot. So it's often introspective, there's reflective, it's often value-based, and it reflects an evolution or a change in someone's, the way they see themselves in the world, right? So oftentimes you'll say, someone will go, oh, I live in a flood zone. Now I think I should do something, or I feel a little more motivated. I'm worried about this, I'm anxious. That's an instance of normative learning. Relational learning is understanding others. So you might go, oh, I live in a flood zone. I'm starting to see my environment differently. I'm a little bit more worried. And now I know why that neighbor parks his car on that side of the street. Or now I know why the council has done this. Or now I know why the drains around here or the ditches around here are shaped in this particular way. So it's a relational sort of understanding of people and place. Okay, and we go through those thousands of engagements and many thousands of hours of interaction, and we code for these different types of learning. We turn them into zeros and one, and we run regressions. I'm going to have to keep going. Oh, here's the little twist. Here's the cheeky part of this analysis. To criticize the existing discourse, I put myself in their shoes and I said, all right, I know I have the longitudinal data, but what would my data set show if I only looked at the time point one, if I replicated the existing way that we go about knowing adaptation to flood risk? And this is what it shows. If I only had time point one data, the results would validate longstanding assumptions in the adaptation literature, which routinely interpret cross-sectional associations between experience, awareness, and self-reported past adaptations as proxy for future adaptation. Right? So A1 here shows us that prior flood experience varies across demographics. And that is often, or in this case, older respondents reporting more experience and women reporting less. Model A2, which is the prior awareness determinant, shows us that awareness varies demographically, with younger people reporting higher awareness, which is consistent with research that treats age and social identity as predictors of hazard perceptions. And these patterns reproduce expectations that experience and awareness follow social gradients in ways that matter for adaptation. Model 3 is like my smoking gun, I guess. I need a better metaphor. But what it shows is what I would call a cross-sectional illusion. It shows us that prior experience and prior awareness are positively associated with prior adaptation. And these are patterns that literature frequently interprets as evidence of a behavioral relevance, right? So renters report fewer past adaptations. Those born in Australia report more. Aligning with assumptions that socioeconomic stability and place-based familiarity shape adaptation. And so from this single time point, if we blind ourselves intentionally and we only look at time point one, there'd be no empirical basis to question the widespread reliance on proxies such as past experience awareness scores and prior adaptation as indicators of future adaptation. And this pattern replicates familiar structures within the discourse, findings that have repeatedly been taken as imperfect but sufficient support for us to run awareness raising campaigns, or believe that if we scare people a little bit or we make them a little more concerned about an issue, that will drive a behavioral response. So if I only look at time point one data, this data is confirmed. We would get the illusion of it. So what happens when we look at the longitudinal data? I'm sorry that you may not be able to read it. I'll flick it to people if they want afterwards. But what happens when we do the longitudinal data, which is the lower panel of this, is that all these awareness and concern analyses that are, or considerations, factors that are statistically significant at time point one, or that you could use to infer behavior, get erased. They actually get overrun by the learning factors. And that's critical. In this instance, we were particularly interested in climate change concern. And I'm going to get to in the next slide as well, but climate change concern showed only a marginal association with cognitive learning. It showed no association with normative learning, and it showed a little bit of influence on relational learning. So for those of you who think that raising concern about climate will generate climate adaptation, these findings should probably give you pause. Demographic variables such as being born in Australia or age occasionally matter across each of these models, but not in a way that alters the outcomes, right? So they're a little different here, they're a little different there. They're rarely statistically significant, and they don't really disrupt things. Model 6B, which is the adaptation model, is the key one, right? And that is the demonstration that normative learning is the strongest correlate with adaptation, followed by cognitive learning. So that awareness path does lead to adaptation, but it does so at about 30% less than the normative pathway. So if you get 1,000 people to learn cognitively, and they're going to adapt at a 30% less than the normative pathway. And so once learning is included, climate concern shows no meaningful association with adaptation. And then model 7B shows us the spillover effect, whether or not people are diffusing this through their networks. And these are the kind of quantitative measures that really substantiate the 3 points that I was getting at to begin with. You might say, well, like, what does the qualitative data look like? And this is an example of the kind of data that gets coded. And this is with a particular kind of attention to climate change. What you'll see here is unprompted question. We don't ever mention climate change to people. We say, what in the next 10 years are the biggest risks that you and your household might see? We get a lot of people tell us that climate change is an important concern. This is not, hey, are you worried about climate change? Now tell me about it. This is, what are you worried about? And people telling us that it's climate change. In that instance, we would treat that as a very genuine and authentic expression. But what we see quantitatively through the lack of statistical significance, and what we see here in the qualitative excerpts, is that that concern does not translate into behavior change, does not translate into adaptation, even through this kind of genuine care for climate. And I think, again, what that's doing, and I guess I'm laying multiple ways of thinking about the illusion of adaptation being a product of either concern or raised awareness. Um, I know for time, I want to just keep going. I suspect you're interested in that normative, right? So I've said normative is the driver or the strongest correlate with adaptation at time point two. And these are the sorts of quotes that express normative learning. And so what these accounts demonstrate, or sort of the quantitative models show that normative learning is the strongest. The qualitative accounts show us that the statistical pattern emerges from really sincere and thoughtful reflections. These aren't people who are just blasé about it. They're very deeply concerned about climate change, and in this instance, they're giving us normative learning. And so the participants who did adapt, did implement actual adaptations, did so not because they were more frightened or informed, but because the engagement helped them rethink their responsibilities, their priorities, and their sense of capability. And these narratives, the quotes here, reflect a genuine shift in how people understood their role in managing risk, rather than simple recall of information or heightened concern. And I think that's a critically important way to kind of draw or the main conclusion that I'm presenting to you here. Drawing that to a close, we can revisit the three main points here. And what I want to say is that this analysis shows that reliance on a single time point and classic associations between past experience, past awareness, or awareness raised, or past adaptations produce a systemic misreading of household adaptation in the context of a climate amplified hazard. So when examined cross-sectionally, our data would reproduce the familiar patterns in which experience and awareness appear aligned with adaptation, reinforcing long-standing assumptions. Normative learning, not awareness or concern, but it emerged as the primary pathway to adaptation. Participants adapted when they reconsidered what they could do, when they felt responsible for it, when they felt connected, when they were cared for, when they had time to reflect and think about things. And so taken together, the findings identify a structural weakness at the heart of global adaptation efforts, with implications for those of us who are involved in behavior change initiatives. Climate and risk governance routinely assumes that households will adapt once they understand this. And I'm sure we've all had drinks with people or discussed with managers who just, people just need to know. Why don't they understand this? And what we're seeing here is that they do know, and that's not the driver of change. The longitudinal results show that awareness and concern are poor foundations for adaptation, while normative and relational learning offer a more accurate and I think actionable basis because they explain how and why people reinterpret responsibility, capability, and social connection in ways that support change. So the question I leave you with, there it is whether our efforts to influence behavior are likely to support the deep reflective learning that is shown to correlate with actual climate adaptation, or whether it is oriented towards simply raising the awareness or concern levels of participants and hoping that that then drives subsequent change. When I give this talk to the risk sector, I often ask them, how do you think people feel after they've spoken with you? And the answer is often insulted, treated disrespectfully, treated like an idiot, treated like I was indifferent, those types of not positive associations. And the implication being, is that the sort of environment or is that the sort of relationship that leads people to learn and reflect and really question where they see the world and themselves in it. And I'm going to end it there with thanks to a big team of individuals and the funder, Melbourne Water. And then questions if there's time. Thanks so much.